Hello everyone, and many thank you to Yasha Klotz and Polina Varskova for organizing this conference and bringing us all together here to talk about Tamizdat. The title of my paper, Crocodile on Piccadilly, Kornei Chukovsky and Tamizdat, wraps up what I'm going to say, but with a twist. This is not actually about Tamizdat, but it's about the move Chukovsky accomplished in his lifetime from being a Russian writer familiar with English literature to someone who is producing something in the English language for the readers. But what he produced is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, and I'm going to talk about it today. Unlike the majority of Soviet writers, Kornei Chukovsky had an intimate relationship with Western Europe and its culture, specifically with Great Britain as a country and Anglophone literature as an extension of its culture's global presence. Formerly a journalist who began his career in London in 1903 and 04 as a correspondent of Odessky Novosti, Chukovsky came back to Russia with a voluminous luggage that served him well for the rest of his life. The language for translation, the plurality of figures of speech and visual metaphors for children's poems and tales, and literary history, theory, tradition, and rhetorical competence for his scholarship. Having evolved as a writer in his native tongue, although never able to shed the notorious Russian accent in his English, Chukovsky visited England again in 1916 with a delegation of Russian journalists, which included Vladimir Dmitrievich Nabokov and Vasily Nemirovich Danchenko, not portrayed in this picture. He was invited to join these prominent individuals in spite of his politically unreliable record, namely his collaboration with the 1905 Revolutionary Press, because of the book about British soldiers fighting at the front he published in 1915. The Silent Speak, Tommy Atkins and War. There are two titles and two editions here on the screen. After completing his journalistic mission, Chukovsky wrote another work about British allies, England on the Eve of Victory, Anglia накануне победы, and published it in 1916. Both volumes relied on first-person accounts of fighting, soldiers' letters, and the author's own observations. He had been to the front in France, not with his colleagues, but alone, and even flew a military airplane. Banned for 80 years by the Soviet government, these books now testify to Chukovsky's acute interest not only in Britain as Russia's ally, but also in the British people with their everyday fears and hopes. This was, as the rest of Chukovsky Anglophilia, rather unique. Akhmatova, for example, loved English literature, but she began to pay tribute to the common folk of England in her poetry only in 1940, the famous poem London Song to Londoners. For half a century after his second visit to England, Chukovsky would wear his Anglophone hat with pride. Although his work was not published in Tamizdat as we understand it today, the wartime writing that he produced for the Russian and then Soviet government in 1915-16 and then in 1942-44 bore traces of his direct familiarity with the storytelling conventions and readers' expectations he discovered in England and through the English letters. As I will try to show in my paper, he anglicized his journalistic output in an attempt to cross cultural boundaries at the time when fighting for Eurasia's physical borders was the task of the day. The fact that some translations of Chukovsky's children's poetry from Russian to English were also anglicized, rather than given a Russian setting and a Russian flavor, speaks to the translator's intuitive recognition of the underlying cultural premise in Chukovsky's self-presentation, as well as in his creative output. Before Chukovsky's death in 1969, the British reading public might have known him as a historian of literature, translator Walt Whitman, and once upon a time an acquaintance of H.G. Wells and author Conan Doyle. But there is little chance they knew more. During Chukovsky's lifetime, his work appeared in English very rarely. Although the Oxford honorary degree he received in 1962 recognized his scholarly work, he was asked to give a lecture on Nekrasov, for example, while at Oxford, and he did it in an improvised fashion. Isaiah Berlin, in a note on literature and arts in the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic in the closing months of 1945, called Chukovsky's work for children genius and compared the author of Edward Lear. There is also Babette Deutsch's 1932 translation of Crocodile, published in London by Alkin Matthews and Merit Limited, plus the Soviet state-sponsored documentary essays published in British journals. But those works are pretty much all there was to account for Chukovsky's literary effort in English. The essays on Soviet children during World War II came out, I'm sorry, this is Deutsch. Sorry. The essays on Soviet children during World War II came out in international literature in 1942 and then in Horn Book magazine in 1944. The Deutsch translation is worthy of our attention only as an example of a straightforward, stylistically and verbally tedious, somewhat pedestrian rendering of a source text into the target language. Although Deutsch's translation is not very exciting, it beautifully offsets the quirky, imaginative, and very politically subversive work by Richard N. Coe. His translation came out in London in 1964 after Chukovsky's receiving the Oxford degree, and may be seen as a literary tribute of one English scholar and writer to his Russian colleague. Curiously, Coe's translation makes more pronounced not only Chukovsky's poetic indebtedness to the English Edwardian and Victorian children's literary canon, such as works by Lewis Carroll and Rudyard Kipling, but also his view of children as active citizens, heroic fighters against all sorts of evil, and even participants in productive labor and governance. That view, articulated in Chukovsky's essays, Children and War Children, is what I will address first when discussing the peculiar literary journey of Chukovsky to England, what I am presenting today as his Tamizdat output. We know about Chukovsky's writing for the Allies from his diaries. In the spring of 1942, he is in Tashkent, working in the Republican Committee of Assistance to Evacuated Children and contemplating a new merry victory tale, веселую победную сказку. Chukovsky's son Boris has disappeared without a trace. No news about him since October 1941. From Leningrad, there are tragic news about his other son, Nikolai. He is wounded at the front and his apartment is destroyed. Veredelkina, as Chukovsky guesses, is burned. The composition of the upbeat story for children in verse does not go easily, and to compensate for his creative loafing, which the Writers' Union will have not looked upon kindly, Chukovsky writes a book, Дети и война, partially based on his Tashkent encounters with war orphans, and partially on what he has been hearing from friends and acquaintances, many of whom flocked to Uzbekistan from Moscow, Leningrad, and other locations. The 40-page pamphlet on the screen here comes out in 1942 in Russian. It is immediately translated into English in almost its entirety, and as Children in War gets published in the October issue of International Literature. The diary entry that I mentioned earlier marks the publication. I'll cite in Russian. Я работал тогда в правительственной комиссии по устройству эвакуированных детей. Встречал на вокзале каждый эшелон, привозивший десятки и сотни военных сирот, писал статьи для советского информбюро и для местной газеты, и сочинял антивоенную сказку «Одолеем Бармалея». I was then working in a governmental committee for settling evacuated children, greeted at the train station each train car which would bring dozens and hundreds war orphans, wrote essays for the Soviet Inform Bureau and for the local paper, composed an anti-war fairy tale, We Will Overcome Barmaly. It is noteworthy that Chukovsky mentions his work for Soviet Inform Bureau and his We Will Overcome Barmaly under one breath in this entry. The war tale for children did eventually get written and published in Pionierskaya Pravda in August-September in 42, in Yerevan, Penza, and Tashkent in 43, but with disastrous results. Chukovsky, who put so much effort into whipping up the energetic stanzas about animals, from an elephant to a sparrow, destroying the army of fanged and hooved, bloodthirsty beasts, hoped to get a Stalin Prize for it. Instead, Stalin himself crossed We Will Overcome Barmaly off the short list of nominees. In March 1944, the prominent party critic Pavel Yudin attacked the tale in the Pravda. Chukovsky, Juden wrote, transferred social phenomena to the animal kingdom, endowing beasts with such political ideas as freedom and slavery, and dividing them into bloodsuckers, loafers, and peaceful laborers. By calling Adalé and Barmaley a politically harmful nonsense, Juden successfully shut down its subsequent Soviet publication. We will put Juden's remarks aside, but not forget them, because the transferal of the social phenomena to the animal kingdom is what Chukovsky would always do best, as an author of children's books that had already gained him enormous popularity. That said, it was war, and the rules of the literary game had already changed. If children were to be featured in a work about war, it were they, and not an elephant or a sparrow, who were expected to advance victory. This is the reason why Chukovsky's brochure Children and War and its English translation fared much better than his victory tale. Sov-Informed Bureau, operating between 1941 and 1961 by the direction of Sovnarkom, was on paper a non-governmental organization that made it its goal, citation, to bring into the limelight international events, military developments, and day-to-day life through printed and broadcast media. In fact, however, it was an institution that outsourced propaganda texts and sent them via TASS to media outlets inside the country as well as abroad. Most writing for it was done by an army of journalists with the help of Inform Bureau's literary group, which included Ehrenburg, Fedin, Grossman, and, as we can see now, Chukovsky. Unlike Adalé and Barmaley, Children and War was a propaganda work. Its goal was to show the Anglophone audience that Soviet children were clever, strong, resourceful, and capable of enduring great hardship without any magic help. Chukovsky did not hesitate to monumentalize Soviet children's contribution to war effort in his pamphlet. For example, here is a description of children's productive labor out in the fields. I will read the second paragraph. No matter where you go or where you travel to, you can see all these Vasily Kroshkas like ants on a giant anthill crawling on the ground, weeding beets, carrots, potatoes, planting onions, and pasturing goats and sheep. While those children who are older are mowing hay, rooting out stumps, and draining swamps. In a word, many spheres of work, they are really taking the place of adults who are at the front. Not only Chukovsky says in his work for the English reader that children now play their role in productive labor, which was earlier performed by their parents, but he also celebrates their smallness, like ants, and engagement in hard labor, rooting out stumps and draining swamps. Not unlike the ants, who can lift more than their own weight. By comparing working children to an army, he asserts the grassroots Soviet youth movement solidarity and unity of purpose. The war had hardly begun when Soviet children throughout the whole of the Union, in Moscow, Bukhara, Irkutsk, Baikal, Bashkiria, immediately considered themselves a mobilized army. Such an enormous, monolithic unity of children mankind had not yet seen here. In his pamphlet, Chukovsky also suggests that when Soviet children are weak, the society steps in to make them stronger by means of adoption and intensive care. At a certain point, Chukovsky states that the Uzbek collective farmers who rush to accept parentless children into their families take upon themselves the responsibility of rearing them and seeing to it that they recover their health and strength so that they can become fit for future work. In Chukovsky's pamphlet, Soviet children are portrayed both as victims and fighters. It may seem a paradoxical combination, but in fact it is not. Children and War is written on the cusp of the government media's transitioning from the early stages in war propaganda, when by Molotov signed decree, radio and newspapers were supposed to incite the army men's hatred of the enemy by providing them with graphic depictions of children as war atrocities, to the later stage where narratives about pioneer heroes, young partisans, and other socially active and heroic young people began to proliferate. Writing his Children and War in the fall of 1942, Chukovsky definitely contributed to the incendiary campaign by describing war orphans, victims of the unhuman acts of the ruthless enemy. But he also makes an input in the future pioneer hero narrative canon by outlining 3 categories of Soviet youngsters who are capable of demonstrating extraordinary social agency. The first of them is active home front workers, and Timurovites who assist families of officers and soldiers. The second, partisan scouts who act heroically behind the enemy's lines. And the third, conscientious students who continue their studies of geometry and math even as they weed and plant carrots. His main focus is on children's collective life, which endows them with power to overcome challenges and assist their country, the supreme parent at the time of deadly peril. Sumerism is a mass movement, Chukovsky writes. It is not a sentimental fancy of 2 or 3 individuals, but a lasting broad activity of thousands of united children. Children of the land of Soviets, almost from their swaddling cloths, have a collective life in their nurseries, children's homes, schools, and pioneer palaces. They are accustomed to unity, to being closely knit, and that is why in wartime they have proved, as we shall see later on, to be such a tremendous social help. Why is this insistence on children's wartime agency so important for our perception of Chukovsky as a writer of propaganda for the Anglophone reader? There are 3 aspects of his work in English to consider at this point. First of all, Chukovsky was writing for the people whose literature he had already absorbed and relied on heavily for his own writing. And that literature, along with Charles Dickens's helpless orphans, includes some very powerful young heroes. Oliver Twist had to fight for his survival and future success, and so did David Copperfield. Kipling's appeal to young men, be strong and healthy, always prepared for an exploit, is also what Chukovsky embraced as a writer and as a parent. Lydia Chukovska's memoirs about her, Nikolai's, and Boris's childhood spent in such pursuits as heavy domestic chores, rowing and romping on the shore with their fearless father, revealed the austerity and rigor of his pedagogical methods. And then there is Nat Pinkerton and the resourceful Boy Scout characters of British mass literature, the very literature Chukovsky began to champion upon his first return to Russia in 1904. According to Anna Vaninskaya, who wrote a comprehensive essay about Chukovsky in Great Britain, it was his experience of London that molded the interest in mass culture, which became his defining theme as a literary critic. From the provocative and influential Nat Pinkerton and contemporary literature of 1908 to the unfinished thrillers and chillers of 1969. He may have been the first to treat urban popular culture seriously in Russia, but in Britain the topic had dominated the periodical press for the previous generation, and Chukovsky first turned his attention to it there, surely echoing the approach he found in the reviews he perused so avidly. End of quote. The influence of British boy and girl heroes on Chukovsky was such that he returned to the paradigm of a victorious child in many of his works, beginning with The Crocodile of 1916-17. The valiant Vanya Vasilchikov, who overcame the dangerous beast ravaging the streets of Petrograd and then liberated animals from their zoo prison, was definitely one of those plucky, quick-witted, and capable boys that young British readers had admired for a generation before they made it into Soviet children's literature. Thanks first to Chukovsky and only much later to the early Bolshevik children's books. And if in 1942 Chukovsky managed to revive this prototype by writing about real-life Soviet children, all the exaggerations and imaginary exploits of wartime child laborers notwithstanding, he was doing it not only in accordance with his experience as a children's author, but also as a journalist who produced propagandist works reliant on similar tropes in 1915 and 1916. As Yelena Tolstoy asserts, both of his World War I era books, The Silent Peak, Tommy Atkins at War, and England on the Eve of Victory, included depictions of British youngsters hard at work to assist fighting adults. Most importantly, Chukovsky in them was fascinated with British women who took over men's chores such as driving and Boy Scouts, proto-Timurovites from the land of the lion and the unicorn. It is not accidental, I believe, that Children at War and its much reduced and adapted for young readers version War Children published in Hornbook magazine began with extensive descriptions of the World War II Soviet youth movement that replicated activities described in Gaidar's 1939 novel for children, Timur and his team. In other words, Chukovsky anglicized his propaganda work about Soviet children for the British reader by going back to the heritage that had already fed his creative output for decades. That said, around that same time, he made a major faux pas in his We Will Overcome Barmaly. His war tale in verse also included a Vanya Vasilchikov, but unlike the army of children working and fighting together like ants and children in war, Vanya appeared in Adaleyem Barmaleye alone, flying to the land of Aybalitia in a pathetic little airplane. His exploit was no match for the army of animals who were successfully fighting the enemy with bullets and tanks, as well as with their teeth and paws. When Yudin blamed Chukovsky for his making the animal kingdom the main hero of a children's war tale, he was channeling the regime's idea Chukovsky had already absorbed, but only in his propaganda work. For the Soviet government, endowing beasts with political ideas, I'm citing Yudin, was not an acceptable approach for a children's author bent on depicting the society at war. What was acceptable was the demonstration of Soviet children's willingness to fight and labor collectively and on par with adults. We're now going to scroll forward to 1962-64, to the years when Chukovsky suddenly became a celebrity in England. Two people worked behind the screens to produce the Doctor of Letters degree for him at Oxford. A Russian historian, Sergei Konovalov, who knew Vladimir Dmitrievich Nabokov rather well and who was familiar with the pre-revolutionary circle of people Chukovsky belonged to, and Isaiah Berlin, who visited the Soviet Union in the winter of 1945, spring of 1946, and met there with Akhmatova, Chukovsky, and Pasternak. Although Konovalov and Berlin knew what Chukovsky's achievements were worth, the doctor's mantle came to the author himself as a surprise. On March 5, 1962, he wrote in his diary, "I got a fantastic invitation from Oxford yesterday. The university, for my literary achievements, is planning to solemnly lay upon me a mantle of Doctor of Letters. Can I really be worthy of such an honor? This stirs no other feelings except surprise." We should imagine Chukovsky's surprise then, when 2 years after the Oxford ceremony, Richard Coe produced his quirky translation of the Crocodile. It came out in London and featured some very British landmarks, figures, and rituals on the cover and in page illustrations inside. The Big Ben, red phone booths, beefeaters in beaver hats, and pot-bellied policemen, tea and biscuits, shops on Piccadilly. This is unquestionably a rendering with a strong colonial flavor. Crocodile, whose name is Alexander, who is an esquire, wears a cork helmet and is originally from a muddy little isle in the muddy river Nile. He strolled down Piccadilly singing carols in Swahili, wearing spats he'd bought in Chile, and puffing on a briar, Cole translates. Compare these lines to Deutsch's translation. He could smoke and he could speak Turkish in a perfect streak, and he did it once a week, this most oddly greedy and wordy, very sporty crocodile. Deutsch has described the crocodile almost just as Chukovsky did, adding a few predictable details, green and wordy, and a couple of character traits Chukovsky implied rather than named, oddie and sporty. Coe's hero, however, unlike Chukovsky's very Russian Crocodile Crocodilovich, or its slightly more nuanced twin produced by Deutsch, is a product of Britain's global influence. There is Swahili, trips to Chile, spats, and a cigar. Coe's crocodile also has a more detailed provenance, more relatives, more friends, the entire jungle comes to visit, and more superior social connections. He is easily intimidated only when he is in London. After eating a pooch and a constable, according to Chukovsky's original storyline, Coe's croc flies back to Africa to complain of London zoo animals in captivity to no one else but His Royal Majesty, the hippo. When the king leads the animal army to London, Alexander Crocodile is at his side. From the swamps of the Zambezi, from the foothills of the Rand, out of caverns in the forest, out of burrows in the sand, came the army of invaders, thick as locusts in the land, thick as caravan of merchants on the old road to Peking, a dusty horde of animals relentless and murmuring, while before them strode the crocodile beside the silent king. In place of valiant Vanya Vasilchikov, Coe introduces Jonathan Jones, a brave 6-year-old. Again, in spite of his tales being 4 times longer than Chukovsky, he doesn't deviate much from the plot. In spite of his British name, Jonathan, like Vanya, scares Alexander Crocodile into submission twice. He does it, however, with the help of most amazing weapons. First with a sword of Arthurian proportions, and then with a gun. Like in Chukovsky's tale, Coe's character plays the role of a fighter against evil, but also of a peacemaker. In the end, he offers the mob of animals a chance to live in London along with all the humans, but on the condition that they behave. I will end your old enslavement, ride on scooters down the pavement, potter around the shopping centers, stop at all the banks, learn to play the clarinet, teach yourselves the alphabet, study trigonometry and counterpoint and maths. Jonathan Jones does not, however, act alone. While in Chukovsky's Crocodile, Vanya saves a little girl from danger, in Coe's story, the little girl is herself a menace, and Jones joins Jonathan in setting things straight. I think what is happening in this whimsical rendering of the tale the majority of British readers have not heard about before, and those who read Deutsch's version may have not remembered, is the amalgamation of Chukovsky's Englishness with the translator's desire to make a good story into an even better one. Coe does so by emphasizing child protagonist's agency as well as retaining the local color and turning an inexplicably cold Petrograd no longer on the geographic map into a jolly London town. It has its rhythmically unmatched Piccadilly, a suggestively called hippodrome, and yes, its own king, or rather queen, the fact that calls for an interesting juxtaposition with King Hippo. In other words, Coe's strategy is Chukovsky's own. Aren't all of Chukovsky's animals from the colonial British bestiary anyway? And paired with the translator's poetic talent, result in a fun to read and very odd piece, just as playful and odd as the original Crocodile appeared to be when it first came out on the eve of the October Revolution. In terms of Tamizdat, there is perhaps not enough secrecy or subversivity in what Coe did for Chukovsky in England. But if we pair his translation up with Chukovsky's rare writings in the English language published in the 1940s, we may say that Chukovsky, who reached the readers in England via Coe, was not only more British, but also more himself. Thank you.